I've been doing some research on monsters for a long time already, and when I heard that this year's spring seminar would be about monsters, I was very excited. And I'm currently in the process of writing a book about video game monsters for the MIT Press Playful Thinking series. And the book focuses on video game monsters from the conceptual, functional, and production point of view. And I will ask questions like, why do games need monsters? What kind of work do they do in the game? And how are they constructed by designers? And unlike most of my other work, it's not a historiographical project per se, although I find it really kind of hard to escape history. So it does have an historical aspect, or someone would say like a media archaeological spin to it, which you will see today. And I'm very happy that I can share with you today a short snippet from that book that I thought could fit well into the 20-minute slot. And it's an exploration of Space Invaders, the game from 1978 produced by Taito, and their contribution to a new monster-centered model of gameplay. And I will start by talking about the contextual historical factors that contributed to this new kind of gameplay model. And then I will demonstrate the novelty of Space Invaders by comparing it to its electromechanical predecessors and also just arcade shooting games, non-digital games. So today, killing monsters is considered so typical of video games that it has become a shorthand of sorts for video games in general. So this is, for instance, the nonfiction book called Killing Monsters, which is written as a defense of make-believe violence in the media. But if you go into the book itself, there is no mention of actual monsters. Here is a headline, not a deadline. Here's a headline from the Washington Post. They laughed, they cried, they killed monsters, how friendships thrived in video games during the pandemic. And once again, killing monsters is used as a synecdoche for gaming in general. And how did this happen? How come that we even meet here today to talk about monsters and games and not like sports games or racing games or something else? If we look at the long history of both non-digital and digital games, we find few, if any, monsters in games before the 1970s. There was not really any functional need for them, as most games were symmetrical matches between human players. And monsters as a cultural phenomenon also had not been as popular as they would later become. So to explain why the reasons why this changed in the 1970s, we need to account for some historical developments, and I'll give kind of three examples or 3 points regarding these historical developments and their cultural implications. And I'll start with the, I guess the least complicated one, and that is the commodification of monstrosity and what Henry Jenkins and Bob Rehag have called monster culture of the 1960s. So this was a process that has been explored in the work of cultural studies, and it's also reflected very nicely in the fantastic graphic novel, My Favorite Thing is Monsters by Emil Ferris. I highly recommend that graphic novel. The popularity of monsters exploded in the 1960s as old horror films were shown in reruns on network TV stations, and they were kind of repackaged as fun flicks for children, basically for young people. And around that emerged these magazines like Famous Monsters of Filmland, which were kind of mostly targeted at children and young adults. Then around the same time, kaiju monsters became a staple of Japanese TV productions like Ultraman, some of which were also shown in the West. So around this time, monsters become a hot commodity that can be used to sell all kinds of media products, including games. The second important development is the Cold War and the rise of cybernetic models of the world, employed by the US military first. The influential cybernetic models of airspace assumed that the enemy was knowable and calculable. Moreover, these models suppose that anything that appeared in the computational representation of the simulated world was a potential enemy, a hostile machine. The historian of science, Peter Gallison, has called this idea the ontology of the enemy. The idea has also been discussed by Paul Edwards in his book, quite influential book, Close to World. So all in all, this idea of a digitally represented world full of enemies has its roots in the military application of cybernetics. And hand in hand with cybernetics and the ontology of the enemy comes the digital computer technology that starts to proliferate in the 1970s, and its affordances play an important role in controlling video game monsters. But I also want to point out another thing. I want to talk about the metaphors that we use when we talk about this new technology, that we used to talk about this new technology. Various aspects of technology are often personified. That holds for all kinds of technologies. So, for instance, on TV, we might see ghosts, at least we used to. And errors in computing are attributed to bugs, as in this case, the actual moth found by Grace Hopper in 1947 that is sometimes called the first computer bug. However, the word bug has been used before that. So here you can see an ad for a pinball game from 1931, which advertises that there are no bugs in this game. So the word bug used to mean any kind of evil or malevolent force before it became associated with insects in the 17th century. And you can also see it in other words that contain the root bug. Another metaphor, repetitive tasks are sometimes delegated to so-called demons, such as the mailer demon. In this case, a demon is a servant that performs repetitive tasks. It is invoked to execute these tasks. And this goes back to kind of thermodynamics and Maxwell's demon, but I don't have time to kind of go into detail here. But what I want to point out here is that in general, the agency of the machine tends to be interpreted in terms of supernatural, fictitious entities. And this really becomes a fertile ground for monsters. Just thought about sprites. Sprites, that's another kind of supernatural being that inhabits our screens. So as I understand it, these three movements together, with probably some other contextual factors, contributed to the model of gameplay that we now call player versus environment, a model that had been extremely rare before. In the book, I write about two games that I think had enormous influence on popularizing that model, and that is Dungeons and Dragons and Space Invaders. And since I've given a few talks about D&D before, I'll talk about Space Invaders today, and I'll try to explain what I find so interesting about the game. Something about the player versus environment kind of designation, the formula. I think it can be summed up by this phrase from the Manual of the Calabath by Richard Garriott from 1980, one of the first computer role-playing games. It is thy duty to help rid a Calabath of the foul beasts which infest it while trying to stay alive. So that's like a part of the instruction. I think it really kind of drives the point home. More precisely, I used the player versus environment designation for gameplay situations where a player or players are confronted with obstacles and enemies that are controlled by a third party, either by software or by a human referee. So playing chess against a computer would not be a player versus environment game because the computer has sort of symmetrical goals and resources, whereas a D&D campaign with multiple players would be a player versus environment situation because a team is kind of playing against the system. So now let's get to Space Invaders. Space Invaders was, of course, not the first shooting game. Aim and shoot mechanics go back to darts, shooting galleries, electromechanical arcade games. But when we look at 19th century and early 20th century arcades, one did not shoot at monsters, at least not in the narrow sense of fantastical creatures. The targets were either abstract, like the suits of cards here, or derived from kind of real life themes of hunting, warfare, armed conflict, bank robberies, and so on. So here are some examples of what was considered acceptable to shoot at. And of course, we already see like a lot of racism and speciesism here that will reappear in video games also. Following the popularity of monsters in the 1960s, it is no surprise that several electromechanical arcade games featured shooting at aliens. So here we have The Invaders, sometimes also called The Invaders from Outer Space, released by Midway in 1970, a game where weird creatures weave side to side, bob up and down, a game with spine-tingling moans and groans from a solid-state sound system. But still, it's a game where, as you can see, there's multiple scoring and extended play to make everyone compete. So the point here is that people would compete with each other. As they would often do, Sega followed up in 1972 with their own Invaders game, where the goal was to down the fleeting vehicles of the invaders from outer space. This was also an electromechanical title, and unfortunately I haven't been able to find footage of gameplay. But I have been able to find footage of gameplay of the Midway game, as you can see here. So it's, So it's much like many of the electromechanical games of the time. You would find similar, wait, once more. You would find similar games with, for instance, a submarine theme. There are 4 targets that pop up from below and the flying saucer that kind of moves horizontally. And you can hit them with the missile. When the invader is hit, the red light bulb flashes and all the aliens kind of flip down. So this is Invaders from 1970. And Taito's Space Invaders is much more, though, than a remediation of these electromechanical titles. Earlier shooter games mostly function as a test of skill, measuring how many hits a player can score within a time limit or within a limited number of attempts. Players could compete with each other for a high score or try to improve their own high score, but they didn't have to fear the enemies. The worst thing that a shooting gallery target could do to you was not getting hit. And even early video game arcade titles like Atari's Anti-Aircraft game from 1975 were the same in this regard. Space Invaders really, really raised the stakes. Its monsters were no longer just targets. They fought back, dropping bombs on the cannon that served as the player's avatar. And both the monsters and the avatar inhabit the same space, and the invaders are coming for you. Space Invaders then offered an asymmetrical conflict with multitudes of hostile enemies. As Bob Rehak pointed out, Space Invaders' introduction of non-human others restructured screen identity, disarticulating avatarial forms from material bodies and shifting the mode of consumption from 2-player dyads to solitary space. And I like this quote because it's one of the few that pin down the unique role of Space Invaders in the history of game design. But I do not completely agree with the idea of the solitary space. Instead, I think that the shift is more towards the player versus environment model. And also non-human others had been used before. The designer of Space Invaders, Tomohiro Nishikado, when making the game, he was inspired by Atari's Breakout. And he sought to replicate, quote, the sense of achievement at destroying the targets, end quote, that he felt while smashing bricks in Breakout. And at his disposal was processor technology that allowed for such destruction on a large scale. So instead of mechanically flipping over the targets, as we saw in Midway's Invaders, he could just remove the invader from the gameplay loop and stop computing it, and then the game would speed up. And these were, so we could say that these were digital demons that could be spawned and then banished in an instant. In terms of representation, before settling on alien monsters, Nishikado toyed with other anime designs as well. This story is now, I think, well known thanks to the Netflix show High Score. He said in an interview, first, I thought of making tanks or airplanes as the targets to shoot, but it was technically hard to make airplanes look like they're actually flying. Human movement would have been easier, but I felt it would be immoral to shoot humans, even if they were bad guys. Then I heard about a movie called Star Wars, released in the US, which was coming to Japan next year. So I came up with a game based in space, which had space aliens as targets. So the inclusion of monsters had been driven in part by general culture trends, the popularity of Star Wars, in part by ethical concerns, which also has been considered by some papers and will be by some future papers this seminar. And there was also this kind of desire to display the agency of the machine, to show that it moves. So as you can see here on this image, his designs for the invaders were based on H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds. So they look a bit like sea monsters, because Nishikado actually hadn't seen Star Wars when he was designing the game. Many players at the time were enthralled by the game's audiovisual spectacle and conceptual novelty. The game became a huge hit and inspired numerous other games, including Asteroids, Centipede, Galaga, Defender, and many others. In his 1982 nonfiction book on the arcade video game phenomenon, the writer Martin Amis writes, I had driven toy cars, toy airplanes, toy submarines. I had shot toy cowboys, toy tanks, toy sharks, but I knew instantly that this was something different, something special. Cinematic melodrama blazing on the screen, infinite firing capacity, the beautiful responsiveness of the defending turret, the sting and pow of the missiles, the background pulse of the quickening heartbeat, the inexorable descent of the bomb-dumping monsters. My awesome task to save Earth from destruction. So for him, it was the drama that was the main innovation of Space Invaders. And a big part of that drama was the fact that the player avatar inhabited the same space and faced hostile enemies. So commenting on the game's legacy, Amis goes on to say that after Space Invaders, we were defending Earth against monsters in sublunar skies. The drama between the player and the environment was here to stay. Well, of course, to some extent, the reason behind the success was cultural and relates to the fears of the Cold War era. But the drama also provided an enjoyable player experience. And as a result, shooter games replaced racing and sports games as the most profitable and popular genre. I mean, at least for some time in the arcades. This is well documented in Rayford Ginz's new book, Atari Design. I'm getting to the end. I want to return to my original question here. Why do games need monsters? Games need them because they so often feature conflict with a simulated hostile environment. But this is not an inherent feature of games, and neither is it of video games. The need for monsters and this kind of new model arose at a particular moment in history. Along with Dungeons and Dragons, Space Invaders was one of the titles that contributed to the popularity of the player versus environment model, as opposed to the player versus player model that was popular in sports and racing games. And if you look at the 1970s output of Atari's arcade division, most of the games that were produced were sports games and racing games before Space Invaders. And this model, the PvE model, requires enemies and monsters often played a part, and that can be for cultural or ethical reasons that we've talked about, but also for game design reasons. And one of the reasons behind an introduction of magic and monsters in D&D was gameplay variety, because humans kind of made for boring enemies in the end. And while the PvE model also appears in non-digital games, in the digital ones, monsters also manifest the agency of the machine, like demons that I talked about, and they also embodied the ontology of the enemy that played such an important kind of part in the history of computing. And that's it from me, and I'll be looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.